Right now, 20% of the planet's entire oil supply is trapped. Not locked away in some remote desert or buried beneath an unreachable ocean floor, but held hostage behind a stretch of water so narrow, so absurdly small, that you could easily miss it on a map. That's the Strait of Hormuz. And overnight, military strikes and sea mines slammed it shut, transforming this 21-mile corridor into the most dangerous place on Earth. Every day, massive tankers carrying millions of barrels of fuel are supposed to squeeze through this passage. Or at least, they were supposed to. Now they're not moving, and the moment they stopped, the world started feeling it. Which raises an obvious question. How is this even possible? How does the entire global economy have a single point of failure this fragile? We sliced through mountains to build the Panama Canal. We terraformed the Egyptian desert
for the Suez. If human civilization depends on a gap of water so narrow you can see across it with the naked eye, why haven't the richest, most powerful nations on Earth simply built a way around it? The answer is more complicated and more unsettling than most people realize. Because bypassing the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a matter of moving dirt. And even if we somehow pulled off the greatest construction project in human history, it still wouldn't actually save us. There's a trap in the Persian Gulf, and it's been waiting, quietly, for someone to fall in. The Persian Gulf is unlike anywhere else on the planet. The countries surrounding it, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the UAE, rank among the world's largest oil producers, collectively pumping tens of millions of barrels out of the ground every single day. It's an almost unfathomable amount of liquid energy, enough to keep continents warm, cargo fleets moving, and the global power grid online. In many ways, the Persian Gulf is the beating heart of the modern world. But there is a fatal flaw baked into its geography. The Persian Gulf is essentially an enclosed basin, a dead end. There is only one passage leading in and out of it, the Strait of Hormuz. That's what makes it so fundamentally different from other gulfs around the world. The Gulf of Mexico, for instance, has multiple wide openings. Ships can flow freely between Florida and Cuba, between Mexico and Cuba, and out into the Caribbean and beyond. There are options, alternatives, escape routes. The Persian Gulf has none of that. If any ship, including the enormous oil tankers that keep the global economy functioning, wants to leave the area, it has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. No exceptions, no detours, no plan B. And that's precisely what makes this one of the most strategically dangerous choke points in history. 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade as well. And the strait itself isn't just narrow, it's tightly controlled. All vessels are required to travel within a pair of shipping lanes, one for outbound traffic and one for inbound, each just 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Iran knows those lanes intimately. It knows exactly which paths vessels must take, and it knows precisely how to disrupt them. It doesn't even need to block the entire strait to cause a global crisis. It only needs to make those 2 slender lanes impassable, and it can do that overnight. And that's exactly what happened. Faced with the threat of mines, missiles, and drones, shipping companies stopped sending vessels through. The risk to crew members and multi-million-dollar assets was too great. Insurers refused to cover ships attempting the journey. And just like that, oil prices skyrocketed, supply chains buckled, and entire continents edged closer to an economic crisis. The kind of crisis that, if you've been paying attention, has now happened at least 4 times in living memory. All because of one strip of water. So why can't we just go around it? It's not like we haven't done something like this before. For centuries, geography held global trade hostage in much the same way. Ships traveling between Europe and Asia had no choice but to sail all the way around Africa. Thousands of extra miles, weeks at sea, navigating the treacherous Cape of Good Hope at the continent's southern tip, where violent currents, brutal weather, and rampant piracy made every voyage a gamble with life and cargo. For a long time, that was simply the only option, until it wasn't. In 1869, after 10 years of construction and sheer human determination, the Suez Canal opened, linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea and slashing thousands of miles off global trade routes. Today, it still handles somewhere between 12 and 14% of all global trade. Then, decades later, when ships crossing the Americas faced the same problem, forced to navigate the violent, storm-racked waters off Cape Horn and the Drake Passage just to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The United States carved straight through Central America. The Panama Canal opened in 1914 and instantly transformed international shipping. History has proven it before. When a maritime choke point becomes a threat to civilization, we engineer our way out of it. So with all of that precedent, why can't we do the same for the Persian Gulf? Because the Middle East, it turns out, is largely immune to our engineering. When you look at the Suez and Panama Canals, both were built in locations that made geographic sense the moment you glanced at a map. The northern end of the Red Sea sat barely 100 miles from the southern shore of the Mediterranean. Before a single shovel hit the ground, any reasonable observer could look at that map and see where the canal needed to go. Panama was even more obvious, just 50 miles of land separating the Pacific from the Caribbean. Difficult? Enormously, but logical. The Persian Gulf offers no such obvious solution. The Gulf is almost entirely enclosed, like a cul-de-sac with a single exit. To the north sits the Caspian Sea, landlocked, useless as an alternative. And to even reach it, you'd need to carve a canal hundreds of miles across nearly the full length of Iran. Given the reason the strait is currently closed, that option is not just impractical, it's absurd. To the west lies the Mediterranean. But linking it to the Persian Gulf would require a canal cutting across multiple sovereign nations: Iraq, Jordan, possibly Syria, Lebanon, or Israel, representing decades of construction and costs that defy calculation. To the south, you have hundreds of miles of territory belonging to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Yemen, all sitting between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean. A study published in 2015 actually proposed a canal running 590 miles from the Saudi coast near Qatar, across the country, through Yemen, and down to the Yemeni coastline. The estimated price tag? $80 billion. And that was the optimistic projection. The proposal hasn't been heard from since, having quietly joined the graveyard of grand visions that never made it off the drawing board. Which leaves one last option. The only loophole geography offers: the Musandam Peninsula. Jutting out into the Strait of Hormuz, this rugged stretch of land, divided between Oman and the UAE, represents what is arguably the only semi-realistic route for a bypass canal. At its narrowest point, the peninsula is only a few dozen miles wide. On paper, the idea is straightforward. Cut a trench through it, and you eliminate Iran's ability to choke off the flow of oil entirely. But the Musandam Peninsula is nothing like the flat Egyptian desert where the Suez Canal was dug. It's a fortress of exceptionally steep, rocky, and rugged mountain terrain. Some peaks, like Jabal al-Haram, rise over 6,000 feet above sea level. The land is almost entirely uninhabited, dotted with only small villages tucked between mountain faces and a single coastal settlement at the northern tip. Building a canal here wouldn't be an impressive feat of engineering. It would be a miracle. What looks like a 50 to 60-mile shortcut on a map would, in reality, become something far more complex. Construction crews wouldn't be able to blast a straight line through solid rock for miles on end. They'd have to navigate the terrain's natural contours, turning, bending, winding through mountain passes. A 50-mile bypass quickly becomes a multi-hundred-mile labyrinth. For context, the Suez Canal spans about 120 miles across relatively flat land. The Panama Canal is roughly 50 miles. A Musandam Canal would likely far exceed both in length and in complexity. And with complexity comes cost. The Suez Canal, adjusted for today's dollars, cost around $2 billion to build. The Panama Canal came in closer to $8 or $9 billion, not counting the $5 billion expansion completed in the 2010s. A canal through the Musandam Peninsula wouldn't cost a few billion. It wouldn't even cost tens of billions. The most conservative estimates put it at $100 billion minimum, with some projections running to $200 billion or beyond. And that's just construction. Maintenance and security would add billions more on top of that, indefinitely. Then there's the elevation problem. The Suez Canal works without locks because the land it crosses is essentially flat. Ships simply sail straight through at sea level. A Musandam Canal would be completely different. The terrain rises and falls dramatically, meaning ships would need a large, complex system of locks to ascend and descend as they cross. And locks need enormous quantities of water. In one of the driest regions on the entire planet, that's not a minor logistical hurdle. It's a fundamental engineering crisis. Where does the water come from? How do you maintain it year-round? How does the system function during periods of extreme heat and drought? These aren't details to be worked out later. They're load-bearing problems that could sink the entire project before construction even begins. But let's say, somehow, all of that gets solved. The money is found. The mountains are moved. The locks are built. After decades of construction, the canal opens, and ships finally have an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz. There's still a problem. A serious one. This canal wouldn't be far from Iran. It would still be relatively narrow. Ships passing through it would still follow predictable, unavoidable paths. In other words, it would have nearly all the same strategic vulnerabilities as the Strait of Hormuz itself. A few well-placed missiles, or even the credible threat of them, would be enough to shut it down just as fast. The same companies would pull their ships. The same insurers would withdraw coverage. And the same 20% of global oil supply would be stuck, going nowhere. $100 billion. Decades of work. And you've built another choke point. At that point, people inevitably ask a different question. Why use ships at all? Why not pump the oil overland through pipelines, directly to the Red Sea or other major bodies of water, bypassing the Gulf entirely? It's not a new idea. Infrastructure like this already exists. Saudi Arabia's east-west crude oil pipeline, the Petroline, stretches nearly 750 miles from the country's eastern oil fields to the Red Sea coast. But even the largest pipelines have hard limits. The biggest can move oil at a rate roughly comparable to a handful of large tankers per day. On a normal day, over 100 tankers pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Pipelines can supplement the flow, but they cannot come close to replacing it. They're also expensive to build, difficult to expand, and dangerously vulnerable to sabotage. They help. They don't solve the problem. And that's ultimately why the Strait of Hormuz is so irreplaceable. Because despite the ambition, despite the money, despite the engineering, there is no real alternative. The world's most critical oil trade route is also its most fragile. And there is very little anyone can do to change that. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a passage between two bodies of water. It's a geopolitical pressure point, a place where even minor regional tensions can ripple outward to affect fuel prices, supply chains, and everyday lives for billions of people on the other side of the world. It's a place where geography, more than any military, more than any treaty, more than any amount of wealth, determines what's possible. For all of humanity's extraordinary achievements, as long as the oil sits in the Persian Gulf, the global economy remains a hostage to geography. If this breakdown changed how you think about the world's energy vulnerabilities, hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. And if you want to go deeper, watch our next video on why every Arab state fears Iran. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.